if you told me that at some point this year I would be playing a game whose enemies included a demon junkyard dog, a set of floating, disembodied, aggressively meowing cat limbs, a giant car tire, a homicidal cell phone, and a googly-eyed syringe monster, I might ask you what drugs the developers were on and where exactly I might purchase them. And yet, for NeverAwake, a self-described nightmarish twin-stick shooter with one of the craziest art styles I've ever seen, the commitment to weirdness works wonderfully in its favor. NeverAwake puts you in the shoes of Rem, a young girl who, for reasons not especially clear, has fallen into a coma. The bulk of the game takes place in Rem's nightmares as she fends off her greatest fears through several hours of shooting, dashing, and making strategic use of a huge assortment of upgrades. In between levels, there are brief snippets of Rem's diary to read, as well as the occasional cutscene, which take you through details about her family, her school, and her friends. The diary entries felt surprisingly authentic and convincingly expressed the mindset of a young, lonely child, with all the fears and anxieties that produces. Their non-chronological presentation, which bounced around different characters and themes quite a bit, made them occasionally tough to follow, but overall the story was good enough to keep me interested, even if the end is predictable and not especially satisfying. The primary focus in NeverAwake is the gameplay anyway, which is simple at heart and in my opinion, all the better for it. Each stage's movement scrolls in a particular direction, and as you make your way through, you can point the right analog stick in any direction to shoot your main weapon, or hit buttons to activate your special weapons or your dash maneuver. What's interesting though is that the stage doesn't usually end when the level does. Rather than just requiring you to get through each level unharmed, NeverAwake pushes you to be aggressive by demanding you to sufficiently fulfill a soul meter to win. Most enemies drop souls when defeated, and only when you collect enough for the soul meter to reach 100% can you move on, and you must keep looping through the level until you do. At the end, the game will tabulate a score, let you know how many loops it took you to complete the level, and ultimately allow each world's total score to be uploaded to the leaderboards. Personally, I really enjoyed the way this seemingly simple change to the typical twin-stick shooter gameplay structure mixed things up. Rather than just being focused on surviving the sometimes dozens of enemies on screen, you're encouraged to be proactive and very accurate with every enemy that enters your view. And especially on stages that scroll quickly and powerful enemies full of souls can float by in a few seconds if you don't dispatch them hastily, it really adds a slightly cerebral element, where you're constantly prioritizing and reprioritizing your gunfire. Thankfully, the game also likes to mix up the levels on occasion to avoid repetition. Some of the more interesting levels had a giant blue crystal that followed you around and could be used as cover from enemy attacks. But the crystal itself, when shot, would occasionally release souls, requiring a balancing act between shooting the crystal and shooting enemies in order to most efficiently complete the levels. A huge component of the game I should mention is the upgrade system. As you make your way through NeverAwake stages, lots of upgrades will unlock that have huge implications for not only the game's difficulty, but how you play it. For example, you can unlock items that refill your shields or special attack powers once you're a third or two-thirds of a way through collecting a level's souls. You can also upgrade your special weapons and unlock new ones, or unlock additional slots so that you can hold more upgrades at once. I appreciate the amount of options the upgrade system allows, even though I definitely settled on a few favorites by the halfway point of the game and only really mixed up my upgrade roster for a level or two when I wanted to give something a shot. Though each upgrade is purchased with souls retrieved from each level, for better or worse I was constantly in a position where I had plenty of money and could buy whatever I wanted. This made it easy to customize my loadout exactly the way I saw fit, but I could see some people wanting to have to work for it a little more. The difficulty in NeverAwake is generally well tuned with this upgrade system. Anytime the game started to feel a tad too difficult, switching up my upgrades to adjust to the situation usually did the trick without making anything feel over or underpowered. The only exception I encountered was the final boss, who, for whatever reason, was a massive difficulty spike that took a huge amount of defense bolstering to even have the slightest hope of taking down. It was a frustrating hurdle at the time, but in the game's defense, there are a few great accessibility options to knock the difficulty down if you're having too much trouble with any particular level. I'd be remiss to continue talking about NeverAwake without mentioning the visual design, which tremendously elevates the game. The level and enemy design are mostly 2D drawn artwork placed into a 3D background, and feels inspired by a crazy mix of The Nightmare Before Christmas and Real Monsters maybe. And every time I saw a new enemy type on screen, it was something incredibly weird. And if there's anything I personally love, it's things that are incredibly weird. Nowhere is this more apparent than the boss designs, where the enemies are super freaky looking and impressively creative. There are a good number of these bosses too, and just about every single one was a fun challenge. Again, except for that final pain in the ass I was just moaning about. There were occasional moments where a boss's attack patterns required a little more trial and error than I liked, but in general, most of them are designed well, with interesting attacks that constantly kept me on my toes. Now, something else I appreciate from any Switch game, since it tends to be super rare, but the game targets 60 frames per second and generally hits it. There were times where performance started to lag a bit with lots of enemies and bullets on screen, but usually I never felt this impacted the gameplay, which always felt smooth and responsive, and I do tend to be a stickler for these things. If I were to knock the visuals in any way, I would say that Rem's character feels out of place. Her character model is oddly uninspired looking compared to how imaginative everything else is. Her character is among the only things rendered in the form of a 3D model rather than the 2D drawn artwork, and is by far the weakest looking character design in the game, which, seems a bit counterintuitive for the character you see the most. Ultimately, it's a small nitpicky thing, but something that stuck out to me. Sound-wise, there's not much to talk about. There's no voice acting, and the soundtrack is perfectly serviceable, if not something I think this game will be especially remembered for. To be honest, I don't have a whole lot bad to say about NeverAwake. It's a simple game, but it places its focus more on interesting enemy and level design rather than needlessly adding complexity, which in this day and age of big budget games releasing with more bloat than me after eating most of a large pizza by myself is truly a compliment. By far the biggest negative I experienced playing the game was how uncomfortable it was in handheld mode on the Switch. Really, this is mostly a knock against the Switch itself, which is one of my favorite consoles, but just very uncomfortable to hold for games that require constant dual stick controls, at least for those like myself who have stupidly large hands. The developers at least added some settings to rebind the controls to different templates. One template allows you to map the dash and special attack to the left bumper and trigger so that you only need your right hand to move the right analog stick. For me, this was by far the best way to map the controls in handheld mode. Even so, I found that playing the game dock was preferable a vast majority of the time, which is something to keep in mind if you're looking for portability, and if you also have Godzilla hands. Overall though, if you have even a passing interest in twin-stick shooters, NeverAwake is one of the most creative and well-designed ones I played in recent memory. It'll take you only about 4 to 5 hours to get through its story depending on your skill level, but there's extra content in the form of more difficult versions of earlier levels that you can beat to access an additional ending, and of course playing to get a better spot on the leaderboard if you care about that sort of thing. It's not a masterpiece, but it's a great way to spend an afternoon or two.